I found a story about this lady. She's an aerobics instructor, and she was starting up a brand new class, and she had set up out there and was letting people come and sign up for a class. When this lady approached her and came up, and she says, "Yeah, I'd like to take the class." And so they signed her up, told her what time it'd be, and then at the end, the lady asked, "So, is there anything that I need to bring, or what should I do to prepare for the class?" And the instructor says, "You don't have to bring it. We have everything you need. Just make sure you wear some loose-fitting clothing." And the lady replied, "Honey, if I had any loose-fitting clothing, you think I'd be signing up for an exercise class?" Right. All right, so today is part 2 of a little mini-series that talks about dealing with disappointment. How do you deal with disappointment in your life when things go wrong? We all experience those times when life just doesn't go the way you wanted. How do you handle that? How do you handle things? I was wondering, there's kind of different responses. How do you handle life when it doesn't go well, the way you wanted, when things are not heading the way that you had planned? There's a lot of responses you could have. Maybe you're the kind that just shuts down and retreats. Possibly you're the kind of person that runs away from problems. You're an avoider, if you will. Maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you attack problems and just barge right in. And you kind of go into bulldozer mode, and it doesn't matter, the schedule, the people in front of you, whatever, just kind of gets shoved out of the way because you've got to attack your situation. What emotions are common for you? Fear, worry, anger. Do you get really quiet, or do you become loud and vocal? I mean, we can have different responses when we go through hard times, when life just doesn't go the right way.
So how do you handle life when it goes all wrong, and learning how to trust the Lord? But really, this has been a message even more than that. It's about how can you see the Lord at work even in the times when life goes wrong. Talking about thank God when life goes wrong. And that could mean, have the right attitude, be a positive attitude person. It could be about, how to learn gratitude and thankfulness even in the midst of trials. But really, it's more than that. It's thank God, because when life goes wrong, it might be exactly what He needs to have happen in your life. And this message is trying to capture that, to see God in the middle of all this going on. So last week we looked at 3 things. Just real quickly, I'll just tell you what they were. Last week, and we started looking at the story of Joseph. And the 3 things we looked at last week were God always cares. And it may not feel like it when you're going through the trial, when you're in the midst of the problem, when everything seems to be going wrong. You might feel abandoned. You might feel like God's turned His face away from you. You might be wondering where He is in your situation. But the reality is He always cares. And He's right there with you. Second, God always wants your best. And we saw how Joseph just took his situation, his circumstances, and he excelled in that. And he used it, and he did his best. And from his trials, he learned how to grow up in the Lord and give his best to the Lord and see God's hand involved in his life. And so he gave sometimes we want God's best for us, but we're not willing to give our best to Him. Third, God always guides you. And it may not feel like it again when you're in the middle of it, when it looks like life is being stripped away, but yet we can see God's hand at work in our lives. And sometimes we have to get way down the road and be able to look back before we recognize it. And so in the middle, we want to trust that God is guiding. So we're going to move on to today's part. Before I launch into this content, I need to mention 2 things. First of all, there's a pastor I like to listen to on the radio. His name is Pastor Paul Shepherd out of Destiny Christian Fellowship in California. And the 3 things I want to share with you today, they're actually his outline. I just want to give that credit. The 3 items are his 3 reasons, and then I just want to use them in our context. He used them about the story of Ruth, but I think they fit really well in the story of Joseph also. So I want to just kind of throw that out. Second thing is I need to make an assumption before I begin. And that assumption is that you actually want God's destiny for your life. Not everybody does. Not even if we're following God, we don't necessarily want his plan for our life. Often we just want God to bless our plan for our life. And we have to wrestle with that. Some people say they want God's blessings, but they don't really want God's messings. That he can get into our life and kind of stir things around. And we may not really, I kind of have my own plan. I want to go my own way. I want, my approach here, God. And that whole Wonder series that we did was really trying to turn that around and recognize, do we have the awe of God or do we live in the awe of ourselves? Are we looking for where he's leading or are we only interested in where we want to go? So I need to assume that you're here this morning, not because you'd rather sit in a comfy chair instead of run Bloomsday, but rather you're here this morning because you want God's leading in your life. You want his plan for your life. You want his destiny for your life. Otherwise, nothing else is going to make sense. So, assuming that, we're going to move on and we're going to go back into Genesis chapter 41 this morning. This is where we left off the story last week of Joseph. And as you're turning there, I'll just remind you of what we've looked at. Joseph was a young man he looked like he had his whole life of comfort and privilege in front of him, and then his brothers sell him into slavery because they were jealous. They ship him off as a slave. He ends up at working on the homestead, I guess, of a man named Potiphar. He does well, and he becomes the manager over all of Potiphar's house. Joseph excelled in his work. He honored God in his ethics and how he handled himself. And then finally, it looks like life is kind of coming back on track for Joseph. Potiphar's wife gets jealous of him and has him thrown in prison. Joseph did nothing wrong, and so he's sitting there in prison. We don't know exactly how long he was there, but we know it was at least several years. Someone tells Pharaoh that Joseph has the ability to interpret dreams, and it just so happens that Pharaoh was having this reoccurring dream, and he didn't understand it. So he calls for Joseph. Joseph interprets the dream, and he warns Pharaoh that God is sending him a message, that famine is coming. You have 7 years of good season to store up crops, and 7 years of famine that will, if you store up those crops, it will save the people. So we're going to pick it up right there in verse 37, Genesis chapter 41. As Pharaoh is amazed by what he has told him, and he likes Joseph's plan of storing up the grain. So verse 37, this proposal pleased Pharaoh with all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring and put it on his hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Wow. Talk about a turnaround for Joseph's life. We're talking probably days, maybe hours before all of this. He's been sitting in prison for years, thinking life was over, he had nothing left for him. From slavery to prison to second in command over all of Egypt. You know what I really enjoyed about reading in this account was Pharaoh's response when he said, after he witnessed Joseph interpret the dream, he says, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? I found that just astounding. My understanding and recollection of ancient rulers like pharaohs and kings, they thought they were God. And here Pharaoh says, he just sees in him is the Spirit of God. Okay, but this message is really about seeing God at work in your life when things go wrong. You see, we're starting to get into the good stuff of Joseph's life. Joseph has been now set back up. Joseph has been brought out of his misery. Joseph has been taken out of his prison, and things are starting to look a lot better for him. He was a slave, he was a prisoner, but now we see that God was at work in his life and was preparing for him a destiny that he had in mind. So Pastor Shepard drew 3 principles. Now his, as I mentioned, was from the story of Ruth, but we see the exact same principles at work in Joseph's story as well. And the first is this: 3 reasons to thank God when life goes wrong is, number 1, your destiny cannot be ruined by the decisions of others. Your destiny cannot be ruined by the decision. God alone holds the destiny of your life in his hands. No one else can control the purpose of your life when you've placed it in the hands of God. How much of your life is spent worrying about how other people treat you, what they have done to you, what they think of you, trying to keep people happy with you, trying to smooth your way into some situation, or feeling like life has passed you by or thrown you a curve or misdealt you a hand because of what somebody else has done to you? Now, if you're convinced that God's destiny for your life is a vacation home in Maui, you may have trouble seeing his hand at work in your misery. But I'm talking about God's destiny for your life, where he wants to take you, what he wants to do in you, where he wants to use you. Now, let's not be naive here. People can mess with you, right? People can make your life painful. People can throw you a curve from time. People can bring heartache and pain into your life. Sometimes people bring that heartache into you just because they walked into the room. And you're, oh my Lord, no, I can't handle this today. I love it. Pastor Paul, if you ever get a chance to listen to him on the radio or you want to watch something on the internet or whatever, I really encourage. He's just really funny and animated. And he said it like this: he just feels like there are some people that seem to have the gift of getting on your last nerve. They are anointed with the ability to bring misery into your life. Know anybody like that? I mean, people maybe coming to mind right now. Can I get a witness? Whoa, I never had so much reaction. People have disappointed you. They've talked badly about you. They've promised you something and they didn't deliver. I mean, they've taken things from you. They spread rumors and lies about you. All kinds of things. Who has told you in your life that you were not enough? Who has told you in your life that you are no good? Who's left you out? Who's confronted you? Who's condemned you? Who's stolen from you? It happens. So people can mess with our life. And I don't know what all this brings, to mind for you. I've been praying over this message, and I hope the Lord can contextualize this into your situation and into your life and how what it means for you. But I was just seeing this all over my life. Mostly from a ministry point of view. Because I'm thinking, Lord, I'm trying to do things for you here. I'm trying to move forward for you here. I'm trying to see things happen for you here. And it just seems like people let you down and people don't follow through. And people don't, just as you've invested in them, they leave you. And you have people that you think, oh, this is a person that's really going to help our ministry go to the next level. And what happens is they leave. And it's like we fall back a couple inches. And I just wonder for you, what does it mean? Where are you frustrated? Where do you feel lost? Where do you feel like life doesn't make sense? Well, remember our story from Joseph? We talked about him. He had some people that were against him. He had some haters in his life, really. And the people that threw him into prison were his own brothers. His own family rejected him. They beat him up. They threw him in a pit. They're going to kill him. But they ended up selling him as a slave. But as we read the story now, do you think it mattered one bit to God? It's not, I don't think God really wanted that pain for Joseph's life, although we talked about last week how he seemed to use that pain in his life to teach him and to train him and kind of root out some pride. But I don't think God was sitting up in heaven watching all this, and Joseph's brothers throw him, in this pit and then sell him as a slave, and God's looking and go, uh-oh, Jesus, what do we do now? We got a problem. I don't think so. God was sending Joseph to Egypt, and he used Joseph's haters to pay for the trip. If God isn't worried, you probably don't need to worry. Because he has a destiny for your life. He's working in your life. He wants to do things through your life. And all you need to do is worry about what he thinks, not what others think. Your divine destiny cannot be ruined by the decisions of others. Second point, or second reason you need to thank God when life goes wrong, is that God often subtracts before he adds. Now, you may not like this part of God's plan. If the last principle was about those times when it feels like people are messing with your life, then we also see that there are times when it feels like God's messing with our life. God, what are you doing? Where did you go? In our last story, last week when we talked about Joseph, he was sold as a slave by his brothers. I just imagine Joseph on a tough day, thinking about this, looking through. But, he's out working in the fields. It's hot. He's tired, maybe a little dehydrated, maybe some equipment broke, maybe the foreman had been yelling at him all day long, maybe he had a day where everything went wrong. I just imagine Joseph thinking to himself, well, you know what, this is awful, but at least it can't get much worse than this. That's right. His family despised him and threw him into slavery. But then he does a good job there, and he's raised up into management. He gets into management, and then next thing you know, Potiphar's wife lies about him. She lied about him. He's thrown in prison because somebody lied about it. He didn't even do anything wrong, and he got thrown into jail, into prison. Then he's sitting in this prison, and a comrade of his, he helps him out. He does something good for him. And he says, hey, you're going to be released tomorrow. When you go before Pharaoh, when you go before the king, would you remember me? Would you give him a good word on my behalf? And his newfound buddy just says, absolutely, there's no way I would forget you, Joseph. I'll let the king know. But instead he forgets all about it and leaves Joseph in jail for 2 more years. But in all that, God still had a plan. He never left Joseph. He was working in Joseph's life. He was bringing the right players into place. He was moving things around. He was waiting for the timing just to line up the way it needed to. And we see there's a portion of the story that we're going to read, that we read today, that God was getting ready to actually use Joseph for something that he never dreamed about. But it wasn't until that day that Joseph started to see what God was doing. And I just imagine Joseph going, God, why are you messing with me? What are you doing? I didn't even do anything wrong, and I'm being punished here. What if Joseph would have done well with his life? What if he was obviously a leader, a capable person? He excelled in what he did, even in difficult circumstances. What if he would have kind of followed the typical, self-improvement plan? And he lived, through his life, and he did well, and he, achieved success, and people noticed his leadership abilities. He starts climbing that ladder. He gets praised. He gets moved up in promotions and in places in his job. Maybe he gets a better job with a different company or whatever, and it just keeps kind of growing up. Maybe he works his way all the way up and becomes the same person working for Pharaoh because people saw the potential in him. And he was given the opportunities, and he was given the same job being in charge to feed the people with this grain storage plan. But if that would have happened, what would Joseph have been thinking? Who would he have thought did all the work? Who would he have given the glory to? Who would he have thought was responsible for earning his way into that place? Well, he would have thought it was all about him. He would have thought, I worked hard, I did my best, and I've earned what I've got. But instead, God took him all the way down to the bottom and then revealed to him who the glory belongs to. And then in a moment, he was instantly restored to a place he could never have dreamed God would take him. When I was a youth pastor down in California for 7 years, there was a time when a prominent family made a rather public exodus from the church, and it was because of our youth ministry. I had not been there very long. I wasn't connecting with their kids very well, but really when they left, what they were upset about was the fact that we had too many Mexicans in the youth program. That was their complaint. It really was. I thought that was odd since our community was over 70% Hispanic. But this is a family that they ran a very effective sports ministry. They were a wealthy family. They were related to lots of other families in the church, so it was kind of a little bit of a big deal. But I'm thinking in my mind, I didn't understand their reasoning. I found it offensive on many levels, and it didn't even make sense in a lot of ways. And I'm thinking, okay, see you later. Bye. Don't let the door hit you where the good, never mind. I understand, the church leadership, hey, they're nervous. They've got budgets to figure out and leadership duties to fill now and all this kinds of stuff because they were a prominent family. And I can't say I was very holy here. I can't say I was full of faith. I was really more naive than anything else. And I just thought, bye, see you later. God will bring us somebody else. God will take care of it somehow. And actually, that was the beginning of our youth group. Our youth group at the time, it was a beginning of kind of a decline in the youth group until we had about 8 kids left in the youth group. I even got pulled into a meeting with the leaders of the church, and they said, we don't pay a youth pastor for 8 kids. That's one of those kinds of meetings. So it was a little, and I understood. I get that. They wanted to see that they're making big investments. We want to see kingdom influence. By the time we left, we had about 90 kids in the youth group. So things kind of worked out. But just saw how in that process, and there were other things that we did, there were several times where we made decisions, we made choices, we wanted to honor God with what we were doing, and there were a lot of times when those choices cost us something, and God subtracted before he multiplied or added back, and he does that in our lives. And sometimes we'll hang on to things, we'll hang on to people, we'll do whatever we can to keep people happy or to keep people in our lives. And sometimes when people leave your life, you need to say goodbye and let them walk right out because they're not a part of God's plan for you. And when your life changes and when things go wrong and things are happening, it might just be that God's got something different in store. Number 3, the wrong doors must close so the right doors can open. And I'm not one that says that every open door is God telling you what to do. I'm not sure I quite understand if God closes a door, he'll open a window. I suppose that makes no sense somewhere, but I do recognize that things change in our lives, and sometimes things happen, and we don't understand it at the time, but sometimes the wrong door will close because something else needs to open somewhere else. Think back on our story with Joseph. What if 2 years before this story that we read, what if 2 years before that, Joseph was sitting there with I forget if it's the baker or the cup holder. I think it was a cup holder that he's talking to. And he says, a cup holder, you're going to be returning the cup to Pharaoh's hand. So when you do, remember me. What if 2 years before, the cup holder remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him? Pharaoh showed him favor and he was released from prison. What would have happened to Joseph at that point? Now, we really don't know, obviously, because that's not what happened. But it seems very likely that if Joseph would have been let out of prison at that moment, he would have done what any of the rest of us would have done. I'm free, I'm out of here, and I'm going to go home. And he probably would have just marched his way right back to the land of his family. But instead, he stays in prison. And he continues there, and he's probably wondering every day why that guy didn't remember him. Why that guy didn't follow through on his promise. Why that guy didn't open the door for him to receive something that belonged to him. Because remember, Joseph hadn't done anything wrong. But God was still at work in this situation. And God was still moving. And God was still doing something here. And what looked like a waste of 13 years of his life turned out to be that God was just waiting and preparing for a moment when he needed Joseph to be in that situation. We're going to jump ahead just a little bit in this story. This story covers about almost 10 chapters. So we're going to jump up to Genesis chapter 50 if you want to jump there with me. But at this point, Joseph has been made second in command, and he's gone all throughout the land telling everybody about this plan. You're going to have 7 years of plenty, so save some grain, save some food, store it up because 7 years of famine is coming. And when it gets here, we're going to be ready. And so they go through that 7-year period of working out that plan, and then the famine comes. And it extends even beyond Egypt. And there's other areas all around that are going hungry and thirsty because of this famine. And so the famine even gets to Joseph's family, who had heard that somebody back in Egypt had been saving food, and if they went back, they could buy some grain. They had no idea who this person was, and that it was Joseph. But so they go and they get some food. Now Joseph can't believe it. Here are his brothers standing before him asking for food. He probably remembers back to a dream he had when he was a young man, when God told him that one day his family would bow down before him. But he tests them. He wants to know their heart and what's they're going, how they're feeling. He does he kind of messes with them a little bit. And eventually they go back, they get all the brothers, the father, they all come. They still don't know who Joseph is at this point. They just know that he's the guy in charge. He shaved his head and he's got, Egyptian clothing on. They haven't seen him in 13 years, so they don't recognize him. And then Joseph reveals to them, I'm your brother that you sold into slavery so many years ago. Uh-oh. In Genesis chapter 50, look at verse 18. His brothers are standing there, and they just find this out. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. They're pleading for their life. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? For you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." What did Joseph realize about this story? He realized that not only did God take him through this pit, not only did God take him through this trial and this situation, and then restore him back to a place of favor and privilege, he recognized it wasn't about that anymore. What he saw is that God used his life so that many people could be saved. And God had prepared him so that he could do a work that would keep these many people alive. Sometimes we only see how opportunities, closed doors, trials, struggles, frustrations, only how they affect our life. Joseph was able to see that what he had went through was necessary for God to bring the players into place. It was necessary for God's timing to be right on all this. That it was important for everything that he went through, because now it wasn't about him anymore. It was about what God was doing through him, and countless lives would be saved. When we want God's destiny for our life, we begin to see things a little bit different. And where doors sometimes close, and where sometimes disappointment comes, and where sometimes things don't go the way we'd hoped or we wanted, or where we see that things even have gone all wrong, what we begin to do is we begin to trust in God, and we see that the work and the sacrifice and the effort and the struggle is worth it because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, the one who created all the things that we spent the last 3 months talking about and looking at in terms of the cosmos and the heavens and the universe, gave up his place of position to be born and walk in this lowly life with us. And not only just to walk it and experience it and know what it was, but then to go to the cross and die a humiliating and torturous death that our sins could be forgiven. He gave up his life that we could have salvation and be reconciled to God. It's the gospel. It's the good news. And it's why we live and what we continue to do work for and why we continue to serve and sacrifice and give. It's why we strive, not because of what reward we're looking for, but it's because we are trying to do a work of sharing that message, that others would know the gospel of Jesus Christ. So sometimes a door that might bless and privilege us closes. But in it, God takes us exactly where he wanted us to be. Let's pray. Our Father, we give you thanks.